I wanted to get in touch with you after the events of January 6th, 2021. And I think a lot of people felt really blindsided by what happened on Capitol Hill. What was your initial reaction? Because you've been researching uh, the political far right for so long. Do you think this should have taken us up by surprise as much as it did?
Well, I understand why most people were surprised, but I have to say that I was not surprised. Essentially, I had been studying this originally with George Seldes, who was a very famous early author on fascism, but also Edward Bernays and others who looked at propaganda. And this is rooted in really a kind of political science and sociology area of research that talks about this going back to the 1800s in different forms. So understanding that, at least looking at it in Europe, the rise of fascism in Europe was assisted by right-wing populism as an ideology.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit more? Like, how do you view the right sort of in context? And do you think Trumpism is an iteration of the right rather than something completely new and born out of a vacuum?
Oh, you said it perfectly. Exactly. This is not new in the United States. It certainly is not new in Europe. And it's essentially understanding the really more recent research into this says that fascism is the most virulent form of right-wing populism. Now, not all populisms are bad. You know, they tend to be unruly, but I was an activist in the 60s. I was unruly. So basically, the issue is fascism isn't just unruly, but it basically argues for a kind of totalitarian rule. And all forms of totalitarianism, in my view, are dangerous to and lethal to democratic civil society.
So, in regards to the breach of the Capitol, how does a society get to the point where we have a president sort of egging on these supporters of his and they end up storming the Capitol? Is this unprecedented, or do we have prior examples?
There are actually prior examples. I mean, people can look them up online. It would be meaningless to try and explain them. But throughout U.S. history, there have been people marching on the U.S. Capitol, and in several cases attempting to enter it. And I confess, as a media activist, I was once working with the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, which were veterans who fought in the Vietnam War and then challenged especially right-wing republicanism. And we marched on the Capitol and tried to get inside. Now, we were stopped blocks away. And I think that's the difference, is when the left decides to march on the Capitol, it is blockaded half a mile, a quarter of a mile away from the Capitol. And the fact that the U.S. government and the city of Washington, D.C. Allowed people to breach the Capitol was horrendous and scary, and showed that there was not a serious understanding of the anger of these right-wing populist folks.
What brings these sort of right-wing populists to a point where they believe the election was stolen from Donald Trump and they're willing to, take to the streets and break into the Capitol building? What goes into their being sort of propagandized?
Well, all social movements are built around a narrative, a storyline, and their storyline is that America was stolen by a bunch of liberal and left traitors. And so, there's a maxim in sociology called situations that are defined as real are real in their consequences. It's called the Thomas's theory. And it means people act on what they believe. And it doesn't matter if they're belief system can be challenged with facts because they reject those facts as lies. So if you believe that America is taken over by liberals and socialists and communists and traitors, then you'll act on those beliefs. And that's what you saw in the attack on the Capitol. Now, I have nothing against surrounding the Capitol and trying to block it and getting arrested. What I have a problem with is sacking the Capitol, which it means, going in and destroying parts of the Capitol as part of your rebellion. That makes no sense. If you're trying to save democracy, you attack the seat of democracy. Only morons and idiots do that.
I was going to add too, I like that you mentioned the bit about narratives, because I think sometimes people really fail to understand fascist or proto-fascist movements and the way in which, I would say that they're almost influenced by a mythopoetic worldview that is really almost anti-rational or irrational and sort of given to the passions rather than, empiricism of any sort. I don't know.
Well, I agree with it 100%. You got it very well constructed. Sure. Remember, again, from a sociological point of view, and I'm not a sociologist, but I play one on TV. I'm a college dropout who was abducted by sociologists, and I'm a member of the American Sociological Association now, but as a journalist. And so narrative stories, people who believe stories to be true act on those beliefs. That's what's called the Thomasist theory, and it is really one of the foundational theories of sociology. So if you believe America has been stolen by liberals, leftist traitors, and secret subversives, then you'll act on it, and you'll act just like the Trump people did on the attack on the Capitol. So I wasn't surprised by what happened. What I was surprised by, having been a reporter in Washington, D.C. for over a decade with a congressional press pass, is that the Capitol Police were not adequately backed up by policing agencies, because it's very, very unusual to get even close to the Capitol with a demonstration. Again, I worked on a demonstration that was blocked literally 8 or 9 blocks away.
What do you think is behind the failures that went down on Capitol Hill? There's been a lot of talk about the police and a lot of blame being thrown around. Where do you think the responsibility lies?
Well, with Trump and the Republican Party and the conspiracy theorists on a kind of overview level, sure. But they were overwhelmed, and I can tell you that it can be traced to the very top of the administration and the police forces. And remember that in DC, there were so many jurisdictions. So you had military police, you had not just DC police, you had all kinds of policing agencies and guarding agencies that work essentially for various government entities that failed. And these entities, what was wrong with them not knowing? I mean, this should not have happened, because there should have been adequate police protection of the Capitol grounds in a nonviolent way, allowing people to protest militantly, but not allowing them to break windows and break into the Capitol. So I think there needs to be investigation into that. I know, having worked as a press person with a press pass to the U.S. Capitol, those guards were not given sufficient backup, and that had to come from the top. Those are tough guards. They know what they're doing, and they were sacrificed on the altar of Trump's ego.
But you wouldn't place the blame. There's some people I think that just want to say, "Oh, it's all the people that were working that day," and I'm not sure that's the case either.
No, I don't think that's true at all. Again, I knew those people. I had a press pass to go in and out of those doors. I knew some of the guards after a while by name. What happened is that they were not given the force they needed, and that tracks directly to the Trump administration, because even though those guards are police in a sense, they're really not under the jurisdiction of the DC police. They're under the jurisdiction, ultimately, of Donald Trump.
In regards to you mentioned the conspiracy theorists earlier. It's interesting to me because One of the things I ask whenever something like this happens, what happened on January 6th, in other words, is, well, who helped organize this? Who helped fund this? But that can very easily turn into sort of the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories. How do we avoid conspiracy theories while also looking at the way in which, what's been called dark money and sort of right-wing networks fund and organize these type of events?
Well, what you just said last is exactly the right way to frame it. It's right-wing movements, right-wing funders, right-wing media organizations, which created this disastrous calamity that we saw over the weekend. But that's not new. I mean, this is not a secret plot. This is all out in the open. It was promoted by Republicans in Congress. It was promoted by Trump. Incidentally, my brother went to high school with Donald Trump at New York Military Academy, and he, at Thanksgiving one day, said that he was always a bully and a jerk. So, I mean, this is Trump's persona. He's a bully and a jerk, and he had the power to essentially understaff the policing around the Capitol so that his supporters could break in. And I lay this not at the door of angry right-wing populists, but at the door of Donald Trump.
In regards to the Republican Party itself, do they have any role in this, just in more broad terms, over the decades with what maybe they've promoted ideologically even before Trump? Because we see a lot of Republicans, I think, jumping from the sinking ship now. But do they have any responsibility in all of this?
Some Republicans do. Many Republicans remain silent for too long. And some Republicans have been saying, this does not end well. I think Mitt Romney is one of those people who kept saying, don't you know history? This isn't going to end well. What are you letting happen? And I'm not a big fan of Mitt Romney's politics, but he was right all along about this. And there were others inside the Republican Party who said, look at history. This isn't a good thing to promote.
And would you say that can a line be drawn between this and previous movements that are sort of associated with what people call the fringe or the far right? I'm thinking of things like the John Birch Society, or even more recently, the Tea Party. Would you say that there's a connection there between those movements and later on Trumpism?
In terms of the framing and the storyline of these movements, all of those are connected. It's absolutely true. I think the difference is between understanding the narrative, the storyline of what's happening, and the actions. Most people who believe that storyline of the conspiracy of the left and liberals didn't attack the Capitol. So we draw a distinction between the storyline, which is very widespread within the Republican Party and the political right in American society, and does track back to the John Birch Society, and what happened. There's a disconnect there. So yes, the storyline that has been embedded within the Republican Party since the John Birch Society, and even before with conspiracy thinking, was in part to blame for what happened. But I think most Republicans, certainly most Republicans now, regret what happened. But I think most Republicans also were always very suspicious of that. Some Republicans who
you cut out there for a second. You said most Republicans were always very suspicious.
Yeah, most Republicans were always very suspicious of the right-wing populist storyline, for sure. And I've talked to some of them, and I've talked to some of the staff of some of the elected officials and briefed people in Congress about right-wing populism. So it's a known quantity, but remember, the political mandates of Donald Trump went far outside the norm of the Republican Party, and too many people drank the Kool-Aid, which is a reference to basically, the folks who committed suicide in South America because their leader told them to. I'm not saying it went that far, but the term is used to describe people who have bought into a political or social storyline, which leads them into self-destructive activities.
What do you think the biggest motivators for people falling into these conspiracy narratives and these sort of just xenophobic and very bigoted sort of proto-fascist narratives that Trumpism provides to
Well,
them?
you already mentioned the first thing, which is xenophobia, fear of foreign, defined by them, fear of people who don't belong and who are threatening to the democracy, which is always used traditionally by immigrants and people of color and socialists and communists. And so in the United States, there's a long history of this. In the United States, there's a long history of this kind of xenophobic, paranoid conspiracy theories. And there's a lot of
The Know
I
Nothing Party.
was just going to mention that. You nailed it on the head. Yes, the Know Nothing Party is what a great name. It's not what they meant, but it's how people look at them. They were supposed to say they know nothing about their party when asked, but a lot of us now say they knew nothing about democracy and weren't very smart about it. So, yeah, it's happened throughout U.S. history. It happens in many countries. I mean, you look at the narrative of the Romanian Iron Guard. It was a paranoid conspiracy theory, and look where it led. You can say that about groups on the left and right who adopt these paranoid conspiracy theories. It's not a political right or left problem. It's a problem of democracy having to deal with paranoid conspiracy theories.
Also, in regards to, you mentioned talking to people in DC who are Republicans who don't buy the right-wing populist narrative. In that regard, I'm wondering, do you think that there's an issue where you have this really radicalized base, and it's been getting more and more radicalized, I think, over the years, even with the Tea Party going back to that? Do you think that there's been this sort of chilling effect that radicalized base has had, where a lot of Republican politicians may become a little bit more silent because they don't want to be called rhinos or Republicans in name only?
I think that's exactly right. And you look at what people in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party and the left and the right in the US have been saying is that this does not end well. People were warned about this, but it was a political opportunism on the part of the Republican Party leadership that allowed this to happen. But all along, not just the left, but also people in the Democratic Party, I don't think they're the left, and the Republican Party itself have been warning that this is a very bad idea to join up with a populist party. Well, you have to understand that in Germany and in Romania, the right-wing populists became the fascists.
Where, if you were to pinpoint a moment, maybe before Trump, that you think things really start to pick up and maybe open the gateways for the sort of Trumpist movement, when do you think that happens?
Well, I think it goes back organizationally to the conspiracy theories of the John Birch Society. You've always had right-wing movements, you've always had conspiracy theories, but after World War II, the rise of the John Birch Society really drove a wedge in the Republican Party, and the Republican Party liked their voter base, so it never really broke with them on an organizational level. There have always been Democrats and Republicans who denounced the John Birch Society because they were irrational conspiracy theorists. But I think with Trump, he actually incorporated the right-wing populist movement into his rhetoric and into his election campaign. And I think, as many folks on the right and left can now see, this was a bad idea because it carried their movement and the Republican Party and conservatism way outside of the norms in the United States for them.
What do you think the concerns moving forward are? I mean, I feel like, well, before I ask that, I was going to say, I should preface this with I saw a few articles the past few months sort of saying that things like QAnon were on the wane, that people were starting to question it more. I even saw an article in Slate on December 29th that was saying, oh, maybe QAnon is actually keeping uh, post-election violence from happening because they're trusting the plan or whatever the QAnon motto is. And now, only a week later, we have the January 6th mob breach. What do you think about the media's sort of handling of right-wing populism?
Clueless and unprofessional. This was not right. The idea of right-wing populism as leading to fascism and neo-fascism is not new. There is plenty of scholarship by people who are academics across the political spectrum that have written about this. I mean, some of the people I've worked with in terms of studying right-wing populism are themselves Republicans and conservatives. And so I think the mass media in the United States really fell apart years ago on understanding where this was leading. I mean, there were a handful of people who warned, this doesn't end well. It leads to very bad places. We've seen it in U.S. history in the past. You have to understand that the Ku Klux Klan, the vicious, murderous, anti-Black movement in the United States, was a form of right-wing populism. So that it was smugness on the part of the mainstream media and the failure of the mainstream media to ask actual sociologists, no matter what their political orientation, where this could lead and publish it. And I think that was a failure of mainstream, especially liberal journalism.
And that leads me to the question of, in regards to moving forward, I think a lot of people have this hope that maybe somehow we can, quote unquote, go back to normal. I'm less optimistic about that. I feel like these far right wing movements have been with us for a long time, and they're not going to go away overnight. What's your sort of take on that? Do you think this does go away with Trump, or is it still here with us?
No, that's just ignorance, speaking out loud. The history of the United States is the struggle against racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia. It's like there has always been a straight white Christian bias that has been backed by mass movements in the United States. And to say that we're going to go back to normal is to say we don't need to confront that. And I think that's just wrong. In fact, I think it's reprehensible.
And finally, I wanted to get your thoughts on one of your colleagues who you wrote a book with, Matthew Lyons, recently wrote a piece reflecting on the events of January 6th. And he noted that, we have to address this problem, not just as a problem of facing the far right movement in America, but also not trusting that the state is going to be our best friend either. What do you make of that? Because I know you've made comments on your social media about this issue of whether we should charge the protesters with sedition or not. What's your view?
Well, I don't think there should be a law against sedition in the first place. I think people should be prosecuted for criminal acts that are not acts against the state. I it's a bad precedent. I'm a civil libertarian in that regard and have worked in that area for years. I think he's right. I mean, that's why I co-wrote a book with Matthew Lyons. I think the dilemma here is liberal and mainstream and conservative commentators don't trust the Constitution of the United States and its First Amendment. In a free society, people should be able to say what they think, even up to suggesting that in certain circumstances, violating the law is appropriate. I think that to wind that back and really step on the heads of the founders of this country who put the First Amendment in place is short-sighted, dangerous, and ultimately authoritarian.
Do you think as well that there's been maybe attempts to sort of make an equivocation between white nationalists and the left by certain elements who just want to label both as being, well, they're both just extremists.
I hate the term extremism. It has no value in language. You can talk about political ideology, you can talk about political actions, but the term extremism was invented by centrists to valorize the status quo in a society that was racist, sexist, homophobic, and elitist. So unless you want to preserve racism, sexism, homophobia, and anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and elitism, it's a term no social scientist and no journalist should ever use. Extremism is not a term, it's a denunciation.
In closing, what do you think progressives or left activists should do moving forward, whether it comes to fighting the far right in the United States or pushing back against repressive state policies?
Well, we need to do both. I've always, since I went through, being an organizer and ideologue for a bunch of years, I've come to that very position. I think we have to respect the Constitution because it protects all of us. I respect the right of people to say what they think without fear of arrest. But I think we need to be clear that the problem isn't extremism. The problem is systems of oppression and systems of repression. So whether it's state repression or, racist, sexist, homophobic, anti-Semitic, anti-Catholic, anti-Muslim movements, all of these need to be condemned. We need to defend democracy for everyone, no exceptions, no excuses.
Well, I like that sentiment, and I want to thank you, Chip Berlet, for talking with me. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much for a very profoundly educated interview.